An original podcast from podlatino.com.
In 1983, one of the most important transformations in modern history did not happen on a battlefield or in a packed stadium. There was no official announcement, no wall-to-wall coverage, no images that traveled around the world. It happened quietly, inside computer networks connecting universities, research centers, and military systems, networks that very few people outside that world could see or understand. While the planet faced one of its most dangerous moments since World War II, the future was taking shape in cables, protocols, and languages that would take years to become part of everyday life. January 1st of 1983 marked a technical but decisive date. ARPANET, the network that had started as a U.S. military project back in the 1960s, officially adopted the TCP/IP protocol. To understand what that means, think of communication between machines like a postal system. Until then, each network spoke its own language, and messages could not easily travel from one to another. TCP/IP was the shared language that allowed different networks to understand each other, letting data travel in packets and reach its destination no matter which path it took. It was not yet the Internet as we know it today, but it was the foundation on which the Internet would be built. The problem was that this new world took a long time to become visible. In 1983, most people knew nothing about computer networks or communication protocols. Personal computers were gradually making their way into homes, but the Internet was still an academic and military project. What was visible, urgent, and threatening was the world as people actually experienced it, a world full of tension, miscalculation, and very concrete fears. The Cold War arrived in 1983, at one of its hottest points since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union the evil empire in a speech that March and the space-based defense program he proposed that same year, nicknamed Star Wars, suggested the possibility of developing systems capable of intercepting nuclear missiles from orbit. Moscow read it as an escalation. Distrust between the two superpowers ran deep, and direct lines of communication were thin. Then came September 1st. A Korean Air Boeing 747, Flight 007, had departed New York, bound for Seoul. Due to a navigation error, the plane drifted off the international corridor and spent several hours flying over Soviet territory. Soviet fighter jets intercepted it. The Soviets believed it was a spy plane. Communications between the fighter pilots and their ground controllers were misread. Just after 2 in the morning local time, a missile brought the plane down over the Sea of Japan. All 269 people on board were killed. Reagan condemned the attack as a crime against humanity. The Soviets insisted they had acted correctly. The world watched in horror as a navigation error and a chain of miscalculations ended in mass death. Weeks later came something even more unsettling, though it would not be widely known for many years. In November, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83, which simulated a full nuclear escalation. Soviet intelligence, already on maximum alert after the Flight 007 incident, interpreted the drill as a possible real covert operation. There were moments when some Soviet officials genuinely believed an attack was imminent. Only years later did the world learn how close that simulation came to triggering an actual response. A British double agent working inside Soviet intelligence alerted the West to the level of alarm on the other side. The world had stood at the edge of the abyss without knowing it. The Middle East was adding its own layer of violence. In April, a suicide bombing destroyed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. More than 60 people were killed. In October, 2 truck bombs exploded simultaneously at the barracks of multinational forces in the Lebanese capital, one targeting the U.S. Marines, the other the French paratroopers. More than 300 people died. It was one of the deadliest attacks on military forces since World War II. Lebanon was deep in a complex civil war with multiple factions and foreign interventions, and Beirut kept accumulating destruction on top of what had once been called the Paris of the Middle East. At the end of October, the United States invaded Grenada, a small Caribbean island that had just experienced an internal coup. The Reagan administration justified the operation as necessary to protect American citizens on the island and to counter Soviet and Cuban influence in the region. The operation lasted only a few days and was a military success for Washington, though it drew international criticism, even from allies like the United Kingdom. It was one more reflection of how Cold War logic shaped geopolitical decisions across the globe. Meanwhile, another urgent crisis was growing without receiving the attention it deserved. AIDS had been identified as a syndrome for a few years, but 1983 brought important medical advances. In France, the team at the Pasteur Institute led by Luc Montagnier isolated what would eventually be identified as HIV. In the United States, Robert Gallo's team was making parallel progress. The debate over who deserved credit for the discovery would drag on for years, but what mattered in the moment was that science was closing in on the agent behind an epidemic that had already killed thousands. The medical community was facing a new and deadly disease that the government was far too slow to prioritize, one that carried a stigma that cost countless lives. In June of that year, Sally Ride became the first American woman to travel to space, aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. She was 32 years old and a physicist. Her flight was celebrated as a milestone, though Ride herself was never entirely comfortable with the symbolic role people assigned to her. She preferred to talk about science. Even so, her presence in space sent a message that a lot of people needed to hear. On screens, 1983 was the year of Return of the Jedi, the third film in the original Star Wars saga. Theaters around the world filled up to see the conclusion of Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader's story. Star Wars had become far more than a film franchise. It was a global cultural phenomenon, a shared set of images and references that crossed borders and languages. Pop culture in the 1980s was learning to be truly international. Video games were also making significant strides. Mario Brothers arrived in arcades and then in homes, introducing a character who would eventually become one of the most recognizable in the history of entertainment. The video game industry was going through a strange moment. After the massive market crash in the United States that same year, which took several companies down with it, Nintendo kept pushing forward with ideas that would prove to be the path back for the entire sector. The Famicom console, launched in Japan in 1983, was already pointing toward what would reach the Western world 2 years later. Music was still Michael Jackson's territory. That year, he continued riding the massive success of Thriller, the best-selling album in history up to that point. Radio stations everywhere played his songs on repeat. Music television, with MTV leading the way, was changing how people consumed music entirely. It was no longer just something you heard, it was something you watched. The music video stopped being a bonus feature and became an essential part of the artistic product itself. February had brought a loss that sparked uncomfortable but necessary conversations. Karen Carpenter, one of the most beloved voices in American pop music, died at 32 from cardiac complications related to anorexia nervosa. Her death put a largely invisible issue into public view: eating disorders, how dangerous they are, and the pressure the entertainment industry places on the bodies and minds of the people who work within it. It was a conversation that started in grief and has never really ended. The year closed with the same double feeling that had run through it from the start. On one side, a world still caught in its own tensions, nuclear threat as a permanent backdrop, conflicts without resolution, epidemics that those in power refused to see, violence repeating itself across different corners of the planet. On the other, clear signs that something was shifting at a deeper level. Networks beginning to move information in ways never seen before, science advancing even when politics tried to look away, culture crossing borders with new speed, women reaching space, and fictional characters becoming shared reference points for millions of people across dozens of languages. 1983 was one of those years when the future arrived not with fanfare, but with quiet technical precision, while the present demanded every bit of attention available. The networks that adopted a common language that year would take more than a decade to become something people could use from their own homes. But the foundation was in place. And while the news was full of missiles, bombings, and diplomatic tensions, somewhere in a university server, data was already moving from one network to another without asking anyone's permission.